Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I am Ladi Akiridoluale. The headlines. White House announces an additional $800 million in aid to Ukraine. Ammunition blast badly damages major Russian ship in Black Sea Fleet. And rescue workers dig in with bare hands, pull Poppy out of rubble in the crisis. Reports out of Ukraine indicate that over 1,000 of its soldiers are said to have surrendered in Mariupol city as Russia's strike on Ukrainian military targets with high-precision weapons continues, and that's according to the Russian Defense Ministry. Video released by the ministry showed a Russian warship firing missiles from the waters of the Black Sea. Its spokesperson, Igor Konashenkov, says that 1,026 soldiers from Ukraine's 36th Marine Brigade, including 162 officers, had laid down their arms near the Ilyushin Iron and Steel Works. A statement from the Russian Defense Ministry also added that Russia has fully taken the port of Mariupol from the Azov battalion and freed all hostages. The rest of the Ukrainian forces are all unable to escape, and that's according to the statement. The Russian Defense Ministry warned that if attacks on Russian territory continue, its forces will strike at places in Ukraine, including Kiev. Earlier, the governor of Russia's Kursk region had said that frontier guards in the region bordering Ukraine had come under fire and that Russian forces had fired back. No casualties or property damage was reported. And as we've been telling you, the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, the Moscow missile cruiser, was badly damaged when ammunition on board blew up, again according to the Russian Defense Ministry. It blamed the blast on a fire and said the cause was being investigated. The crew has, however, been evacuated. A Ukrainian official earlier said the Moscow had been hit by 2 missiles but did not give any evidence. The 12,500-ton ship has a crew of around 500. Maxim Mashenko, governor of the region around the Black Sea port of Odessa, earlier had said in an online post that 2 anti-ship missiles had hit the cruiser but did not provide evidence. Last month, Ukraine said it had destroyed a large Russian landing support ship, the Osk, on the smaller sea of Azov to the northeast of the Black Sea. Moscow has not commented on what happened to that ship. Meanwhile, as Ukraine prepares for an aggressive Russian assault expected in the east, the White House has announced an additional $800 million in military assistance. The latest package includes artillery systems, artillery rounds, and armored personnel carriers, according to President Joe Biden. This was after he had a phone call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelinsky. Mr. Zelinsky had been pleading with the United States and European leaders to provide heavier arms and equipment as his country faces an invasion that has killed thousands and displaced millions.
These are not highly complex systems. The systems that will probably require some additional training for Ukrainian forces are the howitzers, the TPQ-36 counter-artillery radar. Not a very difficult system to operate, but it's not one that they have in their inventory.
The United States stopped short of promising to launch its own inquiry to determine whether genocide was committed by Russia in Ukraine, but says it will support international efforts to hold Russia accountable. President Biden had said for the first time that Russia's invasion amounts to genocide, a significant escalation of his rhetoric. U.S. State Department spokesperson Ned Price declined to say whether Mr. Biden's comments reflected the overall position of the U.S. government, but said the president was speaking to the impression he had garnered from watching the horrific footage that was seen from Ukraine. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said the Biden administration would further assess whether to launch its own formal review.
He called it a genocide yesterday, not once, but twice, actually, because, as he said yesterday, it's becoming clearer and clearer each day that it is Putin's aim to wipe out the idea of being Ukrainian, that we're seeing greater brutality increase day by day. And some of that, I will note, is because we're gaining greater access to areas. We have more intelligence on what's happening in areas. Leaders are speaking out more about it. And frankly, there's also reporting about what is happening on the ground. But to give you some specifics, I would note that, of course, what we saw in Bucha was not an anomaly as Ukrainian forces searched towns that Russian forces previously occupied as they're pulling back and moving to the east. The mayor and the city council of Mariupol are reporting high numbers of civilian casualties. The train station attack just over the weekend killed more than 50 civilians. The UN has recently recorded 4,450 civilian casualties, all just since February 24th, and the real number, we believe, is likely much higher. A consideration of genocide takes years. I mean, look at, there are many past examples, and if you look at even Uyghurs, right, and what we've called out happening in China, that took many years to call out. That hasn't meant we've provided a range of military assistance. What we are doing now is we're trying to prop up and support Ukrainian leaders. There are other, and the military, of course, there are other leaders who have, in the world, who have said something similar to what the president has said recently, because they're also seeing the atrocities on the ground. I don't know that it's changed policy or confused anyone. I think they're speaking all from what they are seeing with their own eyes as we look at the visuals of what's happening on the ground.
Meanwhile, the Kremlin says Mr. Biden's genocide comments were wrong and unacceptable. It categorically disagrees with the U.S. President Joe Biden's description of Russia's actions in Ukraine as genocide. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelinsky has said that Russia should leave the international community if it doesn't want to pursue a peace agreement. In a video address, he said either the Russian leadership will really seek peace, or as a result of this war, Russia will leave the international arena forever. He also reiterated his call for a total embargo of Russian oil, saying the European Union must stop sponsoring Russia's military machine. Mr. Zelensky expressed gratitude to President Biden after he pledged another massive weapons shipment to Ukraine. Let's talk to Oluseyi Adeyemo. He's a public policy analyst, and he joins us now virtually. Good morning, Mr. Adeyemo. Thank you for your time.
Good morning, Laddie. Thank you so much for having me.
We do seem, as has been reported over the last couple of days, to have achieved some kind of stalemate here. Russia not being able to conquer, and I use that word carefully, Ukraine, partly because of the support that Ukraine is receiving from everywhere else, but Ukraine unable to totally put Russia out because of Russia's superior military strength. So with that stalemate now, do you think there is more motivation on ground to move towards possible negotiations or return to the peace talks?
I think so, because the truth of the matter is, from both ends, I want to believe that both parties never expected this. Russia, on its part, probably never knew that the Ukrainians would be able to stand their own as they've been able to. I'm sure President Putin never thought in his wildest dreams that they would get this kind of support, and that President Zelinsky would have the kind of courage that he's exhibited. I would also want to say that Ukrainians never thought that Russia would ever invade them and would do all of the things they've done. I mean, the truth of the matter is the rest of the world. I, as a person, never thought that in this time and age, any president would want to go. I mean, whatever it is, we thought we had come to an age where we all talk and we negotiate on the table. So I'm hopeful that the result, or the stand as it is today, would kind of push all of us back to where we all thought we now do things on the table, negotiations. We never thought that we would start to, kill ourselves like we're doing right now. So I want to believe that the stand-up, as it were, has kind of helped to send some signal to both parties that what we need to do is to talk as civilized people that we are now.
The president of Ukraine has indicated that he's prepared to continue with the peace talks. In fact, he has also indicated that he would like a situation where himself and President Vladimir Putin could sit down one-on-one and talk about this situation. But this week, the Russian president said that the talks had reached a dead end because there were no concrete proposals addressing any of the concerns that they had put on the table. And someone I had spoken to earlier on this week had said the combination of outside forces participating in the conflict is not just Russia and Ukraine. There are other people involved, that the end game is to, before returning to peace talks, bleed Russia long enough as to present Ukraine with an advantage if and when they return to peace talks. Do you think this is what is happening?
You know, see, the truth is, when a person decides to take a decision, like President Putin has taken, he has some demand, he has some expectations. And for whatever it's worth, like I said earlier, it doesn't look like it's going the way he had proposed it will go. And so that in itself is making him do a lot of think and rethink. And you're very right. There are a lot of parties and interests that is involved in this. This is not just Russia and Ukraine. This is the world. This is US. This is Europe. This is a lot of people. I mean, India, China. A lot of people's interests are involved. And we're talking about Russia, because Russia then is not just any country. I mean, these are the people who sort of supply the rest of the world with, you know, gas, with food, and a lot of things are being played out. And we all know that whatever we do in this world, it's always clear that politics and economics, a lot of interests are always in play. So you're very right that we're not just dealing with the interest of Russia and Ukraine. We're dealing with interest of a lot of countries, of a lot of power blocks, of a lot of people whose interest. I mean, you can imagine yesterday, the president of France, you know, was being quoted, you know, to saying, look, I cannot outrightly say this is genocide. This is not some, I mean, and he had to prove it. He had to say to the rest of the world, yes, I see what is happening. I'm not comfortable with it, but I cannot just use the word genocide. The president of America had used the word genocide and all that. And so you will see a situation where people cannot expressly take certain decisions or do certain things. But, you know, at the end of the day, we just pray that whatever is happening, the thousands of people that are dying in Ukraine, you know, this will stop, because it is not something that everybody is happy about. It happens on a daily basis, and it is very saddening what we're seeing there.
Among the many players that you mentioned yourself just now who are involved one way or the other in this is China. And I'd asked quite a number of those I've spoken to this week about the role that China has or could possibly play in all of this. There are those who say that China is about the biggest country left, the most powerful military country left that has good relations with Russia, and that the trust built between the president of China and the president of Russia means that it is quite possible for the Chinese to play a mediatory role in all of this. Because Russia, in this case, is the aggressor. But do you think that is feasible, especially against the background that because of that relationship, China may not be as trusted by the Ukrainians and their backers?
You see, the truth of the matter is, the point we are at now, and I'm talking to the world, is not a situation or a point where we mistrust or start to say, oh, that person is wrong or right. It's a point where we would leverage and take advantage of whatever we have. If China is seen as the most viable country, you know, the most probable country, let me use that word, that could do this job for us, I think the best thing is for the rest of the world, Ukrainians and the rest of the world to trust them enough to do the job for us. Because at the end of the day, I know that China or the Chinese are not totally, I mean, they will not say that they're most comfortable with the situation on ground right now. They're just trying to look at what is best for them and what is best for their people, which is what everybody or every reason do. You know, so I think if they're the ones, and obviously they seem to be the ones that we all can entrust this negotiation, to, then we better do. We better leverage on it. And I think this is another lesson we all have to learn. In the way we relate to people, the idea of completely, saying, "Oh, this person is my enemy," or "That person is my enemy, I'm not going to do business with this person," should stop. We should learn how to keep, some level of a second chance as well, where you can leverage on, where you can reach. Because right now it seems that, that hard stand that we normally have at other people is not something that is healthy for the world, and we better learn that lesson from this. And at the end of the day, going forward, we'll then deal with ourselves in a way where we, sort of see the other country as a country that we might need at some point, like we all are needing China right now.
The other part of this, of course, you alluded to it earlier when you talked about Russia being a supplier of so many things that possibly before this crisis and this war began, most people did not know that many of those things came from Russia. To a large extent, that also applies to Ukraine. And in the aftermath of this invasion, there have been people who have said that, okay, perhaps it was time, or we should have, including Nigeria, and that's why I say we should have tried to diversify our sources of many of these products, of wheat, fertilizer, iron ore, and all of that, all coming from these two countries. But in the meantime, while many people are trying to put that into place, the war goes on, and many people are dead, and that means that positions have hardened. What do you think, I mean, as someone who's looking at the situation from the outside in, what do you think would be a best compromise that sees both people walking away with something but nobody being able to declare victory?
Okay, so we're talking about people, a lot of people are dying every day, and it will be very, very impossible for Russia to completely say that they don't have some relation or relatives in Ukraine. I mean, the relationship obviously is beyond just country to country. It's definitely, and which is why this war is coming up in the first place. So I know that everything that needs to be looked at is being looked at, like we rightly talked about. The fact that I've been a standoff, everyone is having a think, everyone is looking at it. There's been enough time to sort of have a second look at what prompted this in the first place. And question, I'm sure, is being asked by all parties: is this worth it? Do we add other options? Should we could we have done this better or in another way that will not hurt all of us like it's hurting all of us? I mean, anybody can say whatever they want to say. I know that President Putin is definitely not comfortable with being called by the names he's being called now. And I know that because he's human, he's a human being, I'm sure there's been a rethink, and everyone is, looking at this in another way. And I'm sure the Ukrainians also want something out of this, because people are losing their homes, they're losing their livelihood, they're losing their family, everybody is being disoriented. And this is not something that should continue for even an hour, not talk of a day. So I'm sure that as it is right now, all of us have learned lessons, and we all want out. We want this to stop now.
Indeed, we all do. Mr. Oluseyi Adeyemo, thank you so much for your perspective this morning and for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
After the break, World Bank reduces sub-Saharan Africa's growth forecast. Please join us again. Welcome back. The presidents of Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, as well as Estonia, have visited the site of destruction in Bodroyanka, about 60 kilometers northwest of Kiev. Before heading to the capital to meet with President Zelinsky, the four presidents walked through the streets where they saw the first building damaged by Russian forces. Emergency teams using mechanical diggers and dangling from harnesses could be seen working to clear the debris. The Ukrainian leader earlier deemed the destruction destruction in Bodranka significantly more dreadful than nearby Butcha with respect to suspected killings of civilians when both were under Russian occupation. A spokesperson for the Estonian president, Alar Karis, said part of the trip was to help Ukraine with investigations into allegations of war crimes. And the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, says that the world is facing a perfect storm that threatens to devastate the economies of many developing countries. The UN chief presented the first detailed policy brief to be issued by the Global Crisis Response Group on Food, Energy and Finance, which he set up to study the effects of the war in Ukraine on the world's most vulnerable. According to him, the war in Ukraine is supercharging a three-dimensional crisis: food, energy and finance that is pummeling some of the world's most vulnerable people, countries and economies.
The war is supercharging a three-dimensional crisis: food, energy and finance that is pummeling some of the world's most vulnerable people, countries and economies. And all this comes at a time when developing countries are already struggling with the slate of challenges not of their making: the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and the lack of access to adequate resources to finance the recovery in the context of persistent and growing inequalities. We are now facing a perfect storm that threatens to devastate the economies of many developing countries. The impact of the war is global and systemic. As many as 1.7 billion people, one-third of whom are already living in poverty, are now highly exposed to disruptions in food, energy and finance systems that are triggering increases in poverty and hunger. 36 countries count on Russia and Ukraine for more than half of their wheat imports, including some of the poorest and most vulnerable countries of the world. And prices were already on the rise, but the war has made a bad situation far worse.
This is very serious for sub-Saharan Africa, and given the context that we see there, it's more than just the conflicts, it's also the climate crisis. So this multitude of crises that are happening in the region, this report gives us, again, the solutions to acting now with the instruments that we have. Otherwise, there will be even more instability. There will be even more crisis as we see it, and that crisis will go beyond borders. Right now, what we're seeing is that the resources are not going towards stemming the tide of this crisis, and that's what we need to see, that it does. We don't see ODA go into military expenditure, but that we see that it's additional if it's to protect lives, and that we need, to keep the ODA, to keep the foreign direct investment, to keep all the tools that we have existing that Rebecca has talked about in play.
President Vladimir Putin says Russia can easily redirect exports of its vast energy resources away from the West to countries that really need them while increasing domestic consumption of oil, gas and coal. The United States, Canada, Britain and Australia have imposed bans on Russian oil imports in response to what Moscow calls a special military operation in Ukraine, while the European Union remains divided on the issue. Mr. Putin says the West was to blame for the energy crunch it was experiencing because it would not cooperate with Russia. Quote, the refusal of several Western countries to cooperate with Russia normally, including with regards to Russian energy resources, has already hit millions of Europeans and provoked a real energy crisis. Mr. Putin also said that unfriendly countries had destroyed supply chains in Russia's Arctic region, and some nations were not fulfilling their contractual obligations, creating issues for Moscow. Let's talk now to Mr. Chidi One, who is a security expert and joins us from the British capital, London. Good morning, Mr. One. Thank you for your time.
Morning. Thanks for having me.
Let me begin from what I just finished saying. Subtle threat there from President Putin that, Russia doesn't have to depend on customers in the West. It can redirect its energy resources to those, quote, to those that really need them elsewhere. Is this just bluff, or could this really be something that, if carried out, could create further problems for both sides?
Well, it's a mixture of everything. So it's a bit of bluff, but you're correct. It will create problems for both sides. So the genesis of the Russian and European kind of energy markets was partly the Cold War and the Germans trying to kind of compensate for their actions during the Second World War, where they devastated the Soviet Union and all of Eastern and Central Europe. So part of it was to integrate their economies by buying Russian gas, making sure that the Russians would be getting some sort of payment from the Germans, and also ensuring that all the states in between will get money because they're getting a transit fees from the gas passing through their territory, as well as getting the gas. And they were all part of the Warsaw Pact at the time, so it made sense. Now, when you look at it today, there is a lot of conversation about Europe being dependent on Russian gas, and this is true, but it's very easy for them to keep using that same system. It's very difficult now for the Russians to build a similar infrastructure, i.e. the gas pipelines, the ports that are needed in order to export their gas to other territories. So to export to China, there's one pipeline, which is very long, very expensive, and the Chinese drove a very hard bargain for the prices. The same with exports to India. Again, it needs to be sent by sea. You need LNG terminals. Right now, the Indians are buying, but they're buying at a massive discount. So both sides will suffer. The European Union will be able to get other gas sources of natural gas and energy from the Middle East, from Africa, but they'll have to invest in infrastructure. Russia will have to sell their products somewhere, but most likely at a great discount, because whoever's going to buy it is either going to have to buy it in rubles or have to go through a very tortuous process to ensure that they can, buy it on the, using the existing banking system, which is closed to Russia due to sanctions. So it's essentially a pox on both your houses. Neither side really benefits from this.
You're an expert in all of this, and sometimes there's a benefit in looking at a few steps ahead. A lot of arms are flowing into Central Europe now, particularly into Ukraine. Very sophisticated, very high-grade weapons, and we're not completely sure, because it's a war situation, exactly in whose hands all of this are ending up. I remember that near the very start of the war, President Zelensky was saying, look, anyone who was a Ukrainian could show up and they'd hand them weapons to be able to defend the motherland. Do you see a situation where even when, and that will eventually have to happen if this is going to end, there is negotiation and peace is restored, that we have already sown the seeds, or they have already sown the seeds for a future crisis with so many high-precision arms in hands that we're not altogether sure who they are?
Yes. So this is the big problem of one of the many big problems of this war, but this is a serious problem which is not getting as much attention because nobody really wants to have to deal with it. But there are people thinking and talking about this right now, in that the second and third order effects of this war. So the first thing is, as you said, a lot of the weapons that are being supplied to Ukraine are deliberately light weapons, man-portable weapons, anti-aircraft, anti-tank weapons, which are a premium on the illegal black market. So everybody from rebel groups, terrorist groups, and criminal groups will be looking to get these weapons. Right now already, there will be criminal networks that will be siphoning off these weapons, both in Russia and in Ukraine, and Central Europe and Eastern Europe, all trying to get these weapons, and get them ready for after the war, when they can sell them at a premium. At the same time, there's also, so we're talking about non-state actors, but state actors as well can exploit this. So Russia or any other country could, acquire a Stinger and use it, plant it outside any Western European capital, shoot down a commercial aircraft, and it's, a great, not just a great terror attack in terms of, the mass casualties, but also the propaganda value of using a Western weapon system against a Western target would be, a great boon for them. So the problems of this war are not just, the war in of itself. It's those, as I said, those second and third order effects. And then we've not talked about the heavy weapons. A huge amount of heavy weaponry has been captured, has been sold, has been distributed throughout Ukraine by the Russians. The question is, what happens after the war to these weapons? Not only will some be sold off to other parties, in the West or even to China, they will also fall into the hands of other parties and other combatants. And Europe is at peace right now, but it takes very little for Europe to descend into war. And if you look at the Balkans or places like that, if weapons start filtering in there, it changes the balance of power and changes the dynamics.
When I spoke to you last, you weren't very optimistic about the peace talks and the negotiations that were going on at the time. For all practical purposes, that has stopped now, even though we're hearing from the Ukrainians that they're prepared to go on and that, in fact, they continue to talk to the Russians virtually. But during the course of this week, the Russian president made a rare appearance at the line of his country's borders with Belarus to meet the Belarusian president. And at that point, he said, well, for all practical purposes, the talks were at a dead end. And many people took that to mean that they were dead. But being at a dead end is not the same thing as being dead, which meant that it was quite possible that those things would still return to the way that they were and that they could possibly improve. In that kind of situation, would you say that there's any hope left for this? Is there any hope left for the possibility that talks could bring this to an end without anybody being victorious, shall we say?
So unfortunately, no. The war will end with talks. There will be a negotiated end to this war, but I mean, when I say there has to be, that's not because I want it to be, but this is just how this war is panning out. There will be more fighting, more killing, more suffering. The Battle of Donbass will take place. The Russians need to have a victory or need to capture enough territory in order to be in a strong position for that negotiation. They're already in a very strong position, to be brutally honest. The capture of the Black Sea coast and their forces in Donbass give them a good negotiating position. But considering the goals that they've set for themselves publicly, they will need to advance much further. They will need to liberate, in their terms, Donbass and Luhansk. They can't do that by negotiations. And the Ukrainians, after all the suffering they've endured, will not accept anything other than total victory. So both sides, unfortunately, will have to fight each other to a stalemate, and then the negotiations will take place. Most likely what will happen is, after the Battle of the Donbass, wherever the Russians are, they will declare victory and try and negotiate on that basis. The question then will be, will the Ukrainians accept that basis or not?
You're in the British capital, you're in London, and the last time I spoke to you, I asked you about this, so I just want you to give me an update about it. The Britons haven't just left the EU before this crisis broke out. This is the first major test of life outside of the EU for Britain, and it happened to be foreign policy. And they've aligned themselves with EU policy on this one and with American policy, which we would say would be traditional. But in terms of the word out there and what the discussions out there are and what analysts like yourself, both in security and diplomacy, have, do you still think that the British public is supporting Boris Johnson's government on this to the hilt, and that the Ukraine scheme that Britain put in place to house Ukrainians fleeing from Ukraine and this crisis is, I'm trying to avoid that word, but I can't, is a vote winner?
Yeah, so in short, yes, this is, for the British government, this has actually been a boon. It's allowed Boris Johnson to escape his domestic problems with this Partygate scandal. It's allowed him to project an image of the image that they've really wanted to project throughout Brexit, but unfortunately haven't been able to because it's been created it's been done so chaotically. But to be able to present an image of Britain independent of EU foreign policy, but in tandem with European values and in tandem with American values. So for Boris Johnson and the current government, this crisis has really helped them. They've been able to project a good image, a strong image. They've supported Ukraine with military equipment, with intelligence. There's been training going on for the past 8 years or so. And as you saw from Boris Johnson's visit to Kiev, that is greatly appreciated and reciprocated. One thing about President Zelensky is he's very astute, a great understander of the world, of the media environment at least. And he understands that boosting Britain is a way of kind of not provoking, but pushing the EU to take a stronger position, because the EU clearly seeing Britain outside of, after Brexit, outside of its kind of circle, doesn't want to be shown up as the weaker party. So Zelensky has fairly cleverly, but not too obviously, played both parties off against each other to kind of get the British who are doing what they want to do, supporting heavily, but to try and use that to push the EU to do the same. In terms of the British public and their support for the war, it is extremely high. So there is a huge amount of sympathy for Ukraine, a huge amount of sympathy for the Ukrainian people. It translates into, as I said, a boon for the government in that they've used the excuse of, well, we can't deal with, we can't change a prime minister, due to him being fined for breaking lockdown rules during this conflict. So all in all, it's a horrible phrase, but Boris Johnson has had a good war. There's a lot more to it than that, but at this point, I think you'd say yes. It's a popular kind of policy. It's a popular theme in the British electorate, and it's unlikely that the government will change tack anytime soon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chidi One, for that update and for your perspective on the situation at this point. Thank you, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
The World Bank has revised sub-Saharan Africa's economy's growth rate 3.6 this year, down from 4% in 2021, as it warned rising food and energy prices fueled by Russia's war in Ukraine could spark civil unrest in the region. While it upgraded the forecast for this year by 0.1 percentage points and said last year's growth had beaten its initial forecasts, the bank said inflation in the region was set to quicken to 6.2%, up from 4.5% last year. War in Ukraine could worsen the factors holding back Africa's recovery from the coronavirus pandemic, despite small direct economic links, it said, due to higher commodity prices, tighter monetary policy, and a fall in foreign financial flows. Of course, when we hear things like that, we go to our business desk. Ini John McWhirter joins me on the program. Good morning, Ini. A lot of English, but basically in simple terms, this is problem.
Yeah, this is problem for the world, but in this case, we're talking about sub-Saharan Africa. Yesterday, we talked about the issue of inflation. So inflation obviously is hiking prices, and the response to that would be that a lot of central banks would hike interest rates. So they want to hike interest rates so that they reduce, mop up the liquidity in the system. This should help tame inflation. But of course, that also has its own side effect. So that's what the World Bank is saying, that when we have less reduction in the supply of commodities, and then you have hike in prices because, of course, demand hasn't really reduced. Then, of course, you have central banks trying to mop up even the little liquidity which people have. Then economic growth is going to be down. And then when we talk of FDI, foreign direct investment, foreign direct currency, in Nigeria, we're already talking about foreign currency for trading, for importation by manufacturers and all that. So if there's no manufacturing, if we don't have anything to export, then of course there's no economic growth. So that's what the World Bank is talking about in this case.
Now, for Russia today, Vitol Group, the world's top independent oil merchant, says it's going to stop trading Russian oil.
Yeah, very important because they are the largest private operators or merchandise company of crude. So Russia has exports about 4.7 million barrels per day. That's what they export. And of course, Vitol is very important in that because they buy and
resell too.
Exactly. So now if they stop, they're saying they're going to stop by the end of the year, but even by this second quarter, they said they're going to reduce, that they're only operating there now because of contracts signed and all that. So they are reducing their operations at this time, but by the end of the year, they intend to stop. So how does Russia get its crude out? Already we know that India and China are doing direct, but others who may, because you know Russia is still part of OPEC Plus.
Absolutely.
You understand? And Vitol has a major role to play in connecting the Russian crude to the outside world, with a lot of countries not having interaction with Russia directly, not able to go into Russia. If Vitol withdraws, or when, as they have said, when they withdraw their services, then we don't know what will happen to the crude. And this goes back to what OPEC was saying, that it will be very difficult, almost impossible to replace
Russia's contribution,
Russia.
Indeed.
Exactly.
Now, the cost, that's oil now. When you talk about gas, We mentioned this yesterday, or was that day before yesterday, where we talked about Germany.
Yes.
And their particular vulnerability.
Yes, yeah. So we talked about their inflation, which is at a 32-year high. Now, they're saying that if Germany, and that's why they're so reluctant about putting an embargo on Russian gas
right.
and all that, it could lead the country into a sharp recession. And they could lose about $240 million, you know, in 2 years. So you don't want to imagine what that would do to the economy, to German economy. And, you know, almost half. So if Russia produces 4.7 million barrels per day, if they export it, Europe gets about 2.7. And then about 45% of what Germany uses in their country for energy, for everything,
comes from Russia.
Comes from that. So, I mean, if they do that, we talked about some steps being taken by the German government at this time. So they've set up an emergency committee and all that to check. And so if they take it to the next stage, which would be to start controlling the power, get the gas, and then they'll select who they get into that, to maybe major households and industry. Then energy is not just available
for everybody.
For everybody. So manufacturers will suffer, households, and you know, it's that weather, there's not like our weather.
It's not ours, yeah.
You need gas, you need energy at every point in time. So it could lead them to a sharp recession, not just recession now, but a sharp
one, yeah, because it's going to come in very fast.
Yes, it's going to come in very, very fast.
Nokia is leaving Russia.
You know, sometimes when you just read some stories and you think, oh, it's just Nokia, we've had others leave. This is very sensitive because Nokia controls the Federal Service Intelligence of Russia. They are the ones who give them network for that service, like our SSS here.
Right.
They are the ones who give them for investigation and all that. Nokia is the one who gives them the network and all that. So they have left. Nokia has left. They've stopped sales and all of that. So what they're talking about now is exiting.
Which means shutting down that
network. But I mean, okay, I brought this to read it. They are saying that as we exit, we will aim to provide the necessary support to maintain the networks.
Oh.
So, and they're saying that they will try to get some licenses that will allow them to still run those services for the Federal Intelligence Service of the
Russian Federation.
Exactly. So, not to leave them
completely hanging in such a way that everything collapses at once. It's tough. It's tough. We'll continue to keep an eye on that. Ini, thank you as always.
Thank you
for the perspective. And we'll take another short break now. When we return, Poppy brought up live from rubble in Ukraine. Act of mercy. Please stay on with us. Welcome back. As the focus of the war in Ukraine shifts to the east of the country, nearly 9 weeks since the Russian invasion, healthcare facilities have continued to come under attack. That's according to a World Health Organization spokesperson. Since Russian forces entered Ukraine on the 24th of February, the WHO has delivered 216 tons of medical and emergency supplies and equipment to the country via Lviv. The WHO plans to deliver 20 ambulances to the Ukrainian Ministry of Health this week. It is also helping the authorities to set up field hospitals to provide essential healthcare services where health infrastructure has been destroyed or damaged. The UN agency has also evacuated those in need of immediate medical treatment to the Polish border town of Krzowa, where the Polish government has set up a health facility to treat up to 200 people.
Roughly 300 health facilities are in conflict areas at this time, and about 1,000 health facilities are in changed areas of control. As of yesterday, WHO has verified 108 incidents of attacks on healthcare in Ukraine. This can range from attacks on health facilities and personnel, transport like ambulances, supplies, and warehouses. At least 73 people have been killed and 51 people injured in those attacks. Over the coming days, WHO will be providing 15 generators to hospitals across Ukraine that have limited or no power supply. The generators are destined for oblasts in the east, in the south, and in the north. And we have set aside 2 generators for hospitals in Mariupol for delivery as soon as we can get in.
Say that
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and UN High Commissioner for Refugees Filippo Grandi discussed cooperation on the worsening refugee crisis in Ukraine during a meeting in Washington, D.C. More than 4 million people have now fled Ukraine to seek shelter in EU countries, while 6.5 million have fled their homes but remain inside Ukraine, and that's according to the European Commission. Donors, including the Canadian government and the European Commission, pledged a combined 9.1 billion euros in donations, loans and grants to support refugees fleeing the Ukrainian war. The fundraising event in Warsaw yielded 1.8 billion euros to support internally displaced people inside Ukraine and 7.3 billion euros for refugees who have fled the country to neighboring states. U.S. President Joe Biden had said last month that the U.S. would accept up to 100,000 Ukrainians fleeing Russia's invasion and pledged $1 billion in new humanitarian aid.
say that this is a time. This is a challenge that has been with us for well over the past decade. When I was last in government, we were dealing with particularly acute challenges, of course, Syria, Iraq, but also in many other parts of the world, from Africa to Southeast Asia to our own hemisphere. We've only seen that challenge increase, and of course Ukraine has now added to the mix with Russian aggression, displacing within Ukraine or outside of Ukraine 2/3 of the children in that country, as well as, of course, many adults. So we are simply grateful for the work that you're doing every single day.
This figure that he mentioned, 95 million, maybe 96 by today, who knows, has gone up by 12 million in less than 2 months with the crisis in Ukraine, with the Russian offensive against Ukraine and the flight of so many people. So that would be a priority for us to discuss, and already I've been here a couple of days in Washington and had very good discussions on how to respond to this crisis, both in neighboring countries and inside Ukraine. But then, of course, an important message that I'm sure everybody will agree here around the table is that that crisis should not make us forget everything else. We've been dealing intensely together with the Afghanistan situation for the past few months, but there are many, unfortunately, many crises in Africa, in the Western Hemisphere, that involve a huge displacement component, and therefore I look forward to continuing our cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for us.
A quick check at the sports. Dynamo Kiev's exiled squad have beaten Poland's Legia Warsaw in a friendly game in the Polish capital to offer fans a brief distraction from the war back home. Most of Dynamo's players were taken out of the country to safety after the Russian invasion, and they are now embarking on a series of charity games under the banner Match for Peace, Stop the War. Dynamo won 3-1, and afterwards their striker Artem Besedin said it was the first time in his career he did not know how to celebrate scoring a goal. Fans were able to choose how much to pay for their tickets, ranging from 8 to 25 euros.
Descended to destroy you.
Вот после собачка. Красавица. Красавица, сейчас водички попьешь.
Спасибо хлопчикам, що швидко, оперативно все зробили тут, все підключали. Спасибо їм, велике спасибо.
Rescuers digging with their bare hands pulled a puppy alive from the rubble of a building, according to a video released by the Donetsk Regional Police. The rescuers heard the puppy whining as they were picking through the rubble. Thanks to the boys for doing everything quickly and promptly here, said the dog's owner, whom you saw earlier on there, while holding the trembling puppy in his arms.
Вон это воды, да, воды. Вот он, глянь, какой красавчик. Ой, молодец. Нормально. Живучий. Все, мы это сделали. Вот после собачка. Красавец.
Rare good news in a season of a lot of bad ones. Thanks for being with us. That's our package on the program this morning. My name is Ladi Akiridulwale. There's an update at 5 o'clock. Do watch out for that. And the show is back tomorrow. Do go out there and have yourselves a good Thursday.